to start off with a few like historical and kind of framing questions. Um, we will get into the history in a little bit, but specifically, when you use the term feminism in the book, what exactly are you referring to here? Would you consider this a political movement, a philosophical framework, or a spiritual
Mhm.
posture?
Mhm.
All of the
Well, I
above?
think, yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's probably all three. It's certainly a movement that started in the 1790s. And it's easy to sort of watch it progress. There have been obviously different waves. People talk about the first wave, second wave, third and fourth waves of feminism. But by and large, the fact that we can say that there are different waves also indicates that there's a whole arc of a movement that still falls under the umbrella of feminism. So I'm not talking about, what my neighbor thinks about feminism, which might be something, different than me. What I'm talking about is what you
Hmm.
can glean from maybe the major leaders of the movement. So starting with Mary Wollstonecraft, going with major figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Simone de Beauvoir, Virginia Woolf, Betty Friedan, Kate Millett, Gloria Steinem, these
Yeah.
kinds of major leaders. What is it that they're saying? And sort of extrapolating from that on a philosophical level, the ramifications of it. So that's really the way in which I've done the analysis. Very much as a philosopher and a historian, and tried to get into really understanding the currents of the period and what it is that these women were responding to. And I think that's the response, the goal really in many respects, and you can see this from Mary Wollstonecraft on, is this idea of trying to protect women from our vulnerability, and from any
Mm.
way in which it can be used by men. And I think that's the basic thrust. But the problem is that it wasn't quite the right medicine for the real problem. So if you want to sort of boil down feminism into like a basic concept, it's basically men are awful. And then the next piece is women must be just like them. It's sort of this
Yeah.
piece of envy that that's the mechanism that's at the heart of it. And everything else has sort of come out of that. So it's this idea that men have done bad things, but women, in order to be happy or protected, need to become like men. And unfortunately, the models haven't been of good men. They've been of
Right.
the men that they're supposedly the ones that they revile. So anyway, that's kind of the big picture of it. But I use all of these different elements to really understand it both theologically, politically, historically, and whatnot. And what's been the engine behind all of it.
If I were to look at, I want to just pick up pause on something you said earlier because I think it's really important to ferret out what feminism was trying to fix or address was
Mhm.
protecting women from their own vulnerability, and we're seeing this actually play out in sort of our modern context with people like, for example, J.K. Rowling,
Mm.
or Rowling, sorry, where she says that one of the reasons why we're trying to make sure that women have their own spaces. Like,
Mhm.
strangely enough, but it makes a lot of sense. Women's prisons where men shouldn't be, especially men who are convicted of violent crimes. And men tend to be convicted of violent crimes way more often than women do. Or women's only bathrooms, women's only locker rooms, women's only sports. And one of the
Mhm.
reasons that she gives, and I think a lot of folks would say, is because we're protecting women based on their
Mhm.
physical vulnerabilities, which are real in the sense of just the physical differences between men and women. So, can you
Mhm.
draw a contrast between what you're talking about and maybe what they were trying to address back in sort of the formative stages of feminism, saying this is a problem, versus what we're seeing
Yeah.
today, which is, I think, a legitimate thing to worry about?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way to frame it, because early on you've got someone like Mary Wollstonecraft. She's writing in 1792,
Hmm.
the most famous tract that or book on this topic, the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And what she's doing, in many respects, her experience is that she had a good friend, and then she had a sister who both were treated terribly by different men. And so she's trying to figure out how it is that women can sort of move away from this vulnerable situation where it's the case that their children can be taken away from them and they have no custody of their children, and situations like that. And then it was interesting when I found a book in 1909 that was written, and it was actually critical of Mary Wollstonecraft, saying, all the things that feminism has promoted have actually not done any of the things that the feminists said that they were going to do. They haven't, because it hasn't fundamentally improved men. It's actually just made women worse. It's tried to make women into something that they fundamentally aren't, and it's denigrated what it means to be a woman while idolizing what it means to be masculine. And I think you can, if you look at the culture, even the last 50 years, where have we talked positively about what it means to be a woman, or what motherhood is meant to look like, and this real idea that if a woman stays home with her children, then she really must not be able to do anything else, and that shouldn't be a priority. And that's been kind of the messaging. But one of the major shifts that happened in the movement was around 1920, when the communists and the feminists decided to join forces. And this is really where we get the International Day of Woman, which is still celebrated, because it was the way in which the communists were trying to court the feminists, because they realized the feminists were angry and very politically engaged and active. And it was largely because of the anger. They realized the importance of making women bitter and angry, because that's when women will be more effective. And in their case, this is what they wanted the communist revolution to sort of take over the world. But part of that messaging and that idea was that both the feminists and the communists believed that we could get rid of gender altogether, that it was very important to erase the family and certainly Christian faith, but get rid of the way in which we looked at men and women as different. So under communism, of course, abortion becomes rampant. Husbands and wives are actually encouraged, or actually forced, to have different days off so that they can't spend time together. There were all these efforts to try to break up the family. Children are sort of shuttled off to have somebody else take care of during the day. And you see the same effort in feminism simultaneously, of this idea of how do we get rid of gender. And Simone de Beauvoir has that famous line of, woman doesn't become a woman, she's made a woman. Maybe I'm butchering that. But that idea of how do we get rid of gender entirely and erase that becomes very in vogue in the second wave of feminism. And that's really where all these abuses come from. And you can see, this as you kind of creep along the movement, you see, okay, what's the first thing they take away? This idea that home is anything good or valuable. Second thing, husbands are bad. Third thing, our fertility is bad. So our children are really an obstacle to our happiness. And then, of course, you progress up to the trans movement, and the movement is really about hacking off healthy body parts off of women, sterilizing us, essentially, but also taking away any kind of mark of being a woman. So that's really the effort, and that's why my book is called The End of Woman, because I think that's been the real goal. And this is the amazing thing, is that you have someone like J.K. Rowling, who comes along and says, and notices, like, wait a minute, you told us that this is really what feminism was about, was the promotion of women. How many times have we all heard that? That's what it's supposed to be about. And now you're going to let men into the women's locker room, or you're going to let men participate in women's sports. So you really see that the ideology just went too far. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the pushback. I think if the trans movement had not happened, I don't think we would be having any of this conversation. But I think it overplayed its hand, and everybody suddenly began to see, like, this is complete ideology. This is unhealthy. This is dangerous. And this is really destructive, not only to women, but what we thought was the movement just for women. So yeah, I think it's really complicated. There's a lot of twists and turns, but you can just see how powerful, the marketing has been, and the indoctrination has been, that we can get to this point where we would think, oh yeah, it's a great thing that we have a man competing with women, in the swimming pool or wherever on the track. And
boxing
there's
ring.
not these
Yeah.
differences.
In actual fighting, where a man is literally hitting a woman
Yeah.
repeatedly, whether it's in MMA or it's in Olympic boxing, which, of course,
Yeah.
things have changed since then.